Yes, friends, on a Friday, it is OGP, where, of course, I am Adam Armbrecht, covering not only the New York Football Giants, but also the Brooklyn Nets over on the Locked On Nets podcast, joined as always by Andy Makowitz, the generational, lifelong, never to be doubted, true and true, blue and blue, Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir, on a Friday?
I'm great. And the reason why I'm great, Adam, is because my company decided to give us a wellness day. So I will be having a nice little afternoon, maybe outside, a little lunch. So I'm fired up and I'm excited this morning.
Well, excuse me, sir, as we shout out over on YouTube, of course, where we're going live. And there's my boy, Ricardo. Happy to see you in on the live stream. I'm sorry, what was that, a health day? Is that what I just heard?
Wellness.
Well, wellness.
A nice little wellness day, you know?
What is that? Remember that? What was that show? No, it was a movie. Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Get well soon. We want you to get well. It's like that. They send a little nurse outfit with some balloons to the house. I'm sure Kelly appreciates that. It's a whole thing.
And I'm basically going to do the same thing that Ferris Bueller did, you know? Like pretend that I'm asleep, sick in bed, and then just ride around in a convertible all over the place. So there you go.
Tragic news around Ferris Bueller, though, is that someone did the math on it. It was impossible. The distances that he was traveling that day, it just would not have been able to be done. So think about that, friends, as we burn your nostalgia to the ground. We don't normally dive too much in onto the YouTube side of things, but I will say Ricardo chimed in with a little extra bonus. He goes, I'm at work right now. It's not a problem. That's what I like. You know, if you're going to be a fan of the podcast, be a fan at all hours of the day, regardless of circumstance. We do come in on a Friday. Listen, this is going to be a nice, light, fun one. We said on the last episode, we've got the schedule officially coming out, and we're going to dive into that and do our all too early record predictions, etc. But I wanted to there's so many fun things to touch on. First and foremost, I don't know if you caught it, Andy, that Tom Brady was asked recently, would he give up 2 rings to be able to go back and get that championship in the undefeated season against the New York Football Giants? And he said, oh, my, yes, would I ever? To which Eli Manning went ahead and tagged that post, put it out on social media, I think with something along the lines of as it should be. I love that. I don't have anything against Tom Brady, right? I don't have anything against the Patriots, but I love that that's still, for a guy like him, with all that he's accomplished, he can't get over it.
Well, it's a couple things there, Adam. The first one is Eli Manning just responded with one word, and it just said, never. That's all he wrote, which is just classic Eli, like just complete trolling of Tom Brady. You know, gotta love whenever he chimes in on something. But yeah, the fact that it still stings Brady to this day, the fact that he would give up a bunch of his Super Bowls just to have that perfect season, it just pours salt in the wound to Patriot fans. My brother-in-law is a Patriot fan. He heard that and he was like, please don't talk to me about this. Like, I don't want to relive those moments again. And Adam, it would only have been sweeter if the Patriots didn't lose to the Eagles, so that Tom Brady's only Super Bowl losses were to Eli Manning and the New York Football Giants.
No, I know. It's the only thing that could have been even sweeter. But by the way, shout out Greg, you bitch. In other news, though, we're going to get into the 53 or 55. I think there's going to be a couple extra roster spots this year, like there was with last year and the COVID protocols and that kind of thing. But before we do, speaking of things that are all too early, Todd McShay came out with his projections for the 2022 NFL Draft. And now the only reason I bring this up is as it pertains to the Giants season. We know they're going to get the first-round pick from the Chicago Bears. So you would assume that could be a potentially very high draft pick for the New York Football Giants because the Bears, while they did draft what they hope is going to be their future starting quarterback in Justin Fields, that usually means there's going to be some bumps in the road. Let's hope that, by the way, Aaron Rodgers somehow stays in Green Bay, because that's 2 losses that we can mark down for the Bears. But if I told you that the Bears selection was going to be 9th overall by McShay's projections next season, which is absolutely phenomenal, where do you think he has the other pick for the New York Football Giants, their own pick?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm guessing he has us at 11 again.
You know what? Even worse. So whichever way you want to slice this, 8 and 9. He has the Giants getting back-to-back picks in the first round. And the reason why I bring it up is because that disgusts me at the notion that the New York Football Giants would be a 6-win team or, something in that range, right? This is a season where we're going to have now 17 games, of course. So what? 6-7 wins for the New York Football Giants? I find that unacceptable.
Well, I mean, Todd McShay clearly isn't very high on Daniel Jones or the Giants, but Todd McShay, you got to love it. I mean, I'm sure you're going to tell me who he mocked to the Giants or what position he mocked. And Adam, can you let me know what did Todd think that we needed a year and a half in advance?
Yes, well, obviously, one would assume, right? The two positions everyone assumed they were going to go to immediately. Although I do find a little bit of an eyebrow raise around the one. Offensive line is obviously where he assumes they'll go with one of those 2 first-round picks. And I want to make sure, if I can here, get the names up right for you. And then, so the first one at 8th overall, let's assume it's Chicago. Let's at least make ourselves feel a little bit better that we're not as bad as Chicago is going to be. Adrian Hutchinson, the defensive end out of Michigan. So he goes with an edge rusher at the other role, which I find a little bit eyebrow raising. I mean, you did draft Ojulari. You did take another flyer on Smith there in the later rounds. So, you think you're building towards something, but I'm not going to balk at that. You get a high quality talent for sure. 9th overall was Evan Neal, the offensive tackle / guard out of Alabama. So that one makes sense, right? Plugging in that final hole on the offensive line. But I cannot stand for this type of disrespect. As I said, you and I both know I have McShay's cell phone number. I know where he lives. It'll start with a phone call. It'll go to a personal visit. But at some point, there will be a reckoning.
Todd McShay's early indications tell me a few things. One, he doesn't think the Giants are going to be very good. But 2 is that he's missing it. If he's really doing this seriously and he thinks the Giants are going to have the 8th pick in the draft, then he's got to assume that Daniel Jones didn't play well and that the Giants stink, which would mean that the Giants need a quarterback in that scenario, right? Like he hasn't gone far enough into understand. He's saying like, Giants are terrible. They need an edge rusher when in fact the Giants won 6 games. And there's definitely something concerning at the quarterback position. We probably would have to package those 2 picks up and trade up for a quarterback if this all plays out. But Adam, I'll leave you at that. But the other thing is like, man, I feel bad for Todd McShay. Like starting about today till September, what does he do? Like he's grasping at straws, trying to like put content out for ESPN. It's like, there's no football, there's no draft. So he's like, mock 2026. I saw this 7th grader. He's projected number 4 to the Titans. You're like, what is McShay doing? I feel bad.
I listened to Mel Kiper on some show just after the post draft or whatever, and they said, great, go take a rest, have a break. And he was like, yeah, first mock for next year's comes out. At least his big board of top 300 players. And I was like, come on, guy. I mean, and listen, by the way, good for you. You've built an entire career out of it. But at some point, if you give me a top 300 board of college players right now, 100 of them will not be who you thought that, a third of what you think isn't going to be the case. So good for them, though. They've established themselves. And we know we eventually want to be on ESPN exclusively talking about the New York Football Giants, though. We're not going to branch out. We're not going to go into the rest of the NFL. Just Adam and Andy talking Giants on the national stage, maybe with SVP in the evenings. So there's one quick footnote. Then I want to get into also some takeaways from the draft class. But one, Jason McCourty, who had been speculated was maybe going to possibly be a target for the Giants in free agency. We batted it around. I landed on the idea of, boy, this guy, I think, the tooth is long and maybe about to fall out of the gum, but he does end up signing with the Miami Dolphins. Any takeaway on that from the Giants standpoint? Obviously, with the way our draft went, I just think crowded room, you wouldn't even be able to afford to make space for another veteran voice.
Yeah, I mean, once we went ahead and made this selection of Aaron Robinson in the draft, that pretty much solidified that McCourty was going to sign elsewhere. And, we talked about how cornerback was not a position of strength for the Giants at the beginning of the year. We were trying anything we could possibly do, from Madre Harper to Isaac Yedem to Corey Ballantyne. We've tried everything. And now when you look up and you see getting Adoree Jackson in Robinson, surprisingly, there's just no room at the end for someone like McCourty. We feel pretty good about where our secondary's at, Adam.
Yeah, like I said, I would have been borderline bringing him in as it was, just with the state of things. So happy for him, though. Obviously ties to the organization through Joe Judge and his time with the Patriots. Shout out to Mr. Joseph Clark, joining us in on the live stream on YouTube as well. The other news that came out here before we ultimately get to what the big goal is, talking about this roster composition that we're going to look forward to over the course of the offseason, is where some of other organizations and other scouts looked at some of our top picks in the draft. And I wondered if there's any takeaways from these. The first one I'll jump to, and this isn't even really about scouting, this is just about a player selection. The Indianapolis Colts came out and said they thought for sure that the Giants were going to take Kwity Paye just ahead of them after they traded back to the 20th overall pick. It feels like everybody had that sense around Kwity Paye that, you know, we talked about it, right? Just feels like a New York Giant, has all the makeup, all the character, all the components to be that type of player for the Giants on the edge. Were you surprised in that vein as well? We have to go back into the draft, but do you just think that do you think that a lot of teams were surprised by where the Giants went at 20 ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised considering I had quite a bit of money down on Kwity Paye being the first pick for the Giants. So I was with the Colts on that one, and I was hoping for Kwity Paye just so that I could get a little payday from Kwity Paye, if you know what I mean, Adam. But unfortunately, it didn't work that when we took Kadarius Toney. But listen, after the pick, it was largely panned by a lot of the experts saying it's way too early for this wide receiver. And I think a lot of Giant fans didn't think that we were going to be selecting in the range where Kadarius Toney was going to be a viable option. But now after the draft, you hear Urban Meyer come out and say at 25, it broke his heart to see Kadarius Toney go to the Giants at 20, ringing endorsement. You look at the Green Bay Packers with the 29th pick. They apparently were going to select Kadarius Toney if he was on the board. So all of a sudden, Kadarius Toney, by all of the different teams, seems to have been higher than any draft analyst had him. And that's encouraging for the Giants that they did their homework and they got a player that everyone else wishes they could have gotten.
And so now this is where some of the scouting comes into some of these players. On Kadarius Toney, there was a handful of them, one of which, and you got to take this with a grain of salt, because when a scout says something about a player, it is also relative to what their team needs and how their board is constructed. But you've got one that says, in the positive standpoint, he's a, and this seems chuckle worthy because this had to be brought up somewhere along the way. He's a passionate rap artist, said one scout. On green, yellow, red, he's a yellow. That dude's explosive. He's got 10-yard acceleration like Tyreek Hill. Fantastic comp. That's what you want to hear, that you could have Tyreek, take the top off of the defense type of talent coming in the room. But then you have another one who says, we would never have drafted him, but he's a matchup nightmare for defenses in the slot. He's got excellent ball skills and feel for the position. He's strong and competitive with the ball in his hands, et cetera, et cetera. This is the last interesting one on Toney. If I'm looking at it through the eyes of a quarterback, I think that he's kind of hard to read. He does so much shake and bake that you don't always know if he's going left, right, or sitting down. Not to take away from his creativity, but to play within a scheme, you've got to stay within your own area with your route. This guy is a little all over the map. His thing is just the change of direction, so he is so skilled in that way. That is an interesting. I think that's actually a worthwhile one to hone in on, because it's saying this dude is a freakish athlete, incredible talent. Watch out, he's going to be able to get loose on guys. But how crucial is it going to be for Daniel Jones and Kadarius Toney to get together and really start to get on the same page as far as when you're looking to shake and bake? What is your tendency? Where do you want to free yourself up to? To the outside, to the inside? Are you reading the defense and the secondary the same way that I am? Or if I'm Daniel Jones, year number 3, I need to be so in tune with my offensive system and what defenses are going to be doing that I can anticipate the most natural, right? The most instinctual move that Kadarius Toney is going to make, because otherwise you could be talking about some of those little instances where you get the tipped ball, you get the interceptions, right? Because about miscommunication. So that's one facet that was talked about Kadarius Toney coming into the draft, just route running. Is he a natural route runner? Probably not, but we've watched some of the tape and it looks like the guy gets it. So I don't think it's about understanding it. Sometimes from college to the pros, it's the difference of, I don't need to overuse my route running skill set here because I'm more naturally gifted than everyone else. At the pro level, I'm going to have to really lean into that.
So this is an interesting one, Adam, because I think it sounds like such a nitpicky thing that people are talking about here. I'm actually not concerned about that at all with Kadarius Toney. And the reason why is because the air yards the ball is going to go into with Kadarius Toney is probably going to be the lowest of any wide receiver in the league, right? Like I don't see him as a guy that just cuts things up, gets downfield like a John Ross and just burns it to the end zone. He's a guy that's going to be in the backfield sometimes with Saquon Barkley, two dynamic guys. You want the ball in his hands as early as possible. So all of that improvisation that you're talking about is after the ball is with him, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want him running all over the place and running double move routes on the outside. Like, you said it right after we drafted him, and it was something I didn't think about until you mentioned it, but it's like he does bring a completely different dynamic to the wide receiver room that we just don't have today. You look at Kenny Golladay is kind of that big bodied alpha type receiver. You have Slayton who can get down the field. You have Sterling Shepard, which is kind of the possession guy. He's the security blanket over the middle. We don't have a guy that like you could hand an end around reverse to. We've tried it with Evan Ingram with some success, but like it made me think guys like Terrace Marshall Jr., who's 6'3", 200 pounds, he would kind of just be a lighter version of Kenny Golladay, right? Like he would just fill in and be kind of the same position as him. Whereas when you look at Kadarius Toney, he does so many things that we couldn't do on the roster. And because of that, we got better and harder for defenses to pre-snap read us because he's going to be on the field.
Yeah, I feel like, listen, get ready for some go-go gadget Toney. Like that's going to be, that's going to be the tagline for me all season long, because the gadget plays, the just get it into a creative player in space. And then the last little footnote there, as you said, even if you are shaking and baking before the ball is coming your way, you're probably going to be doing that in close quarters as well. So theoretically, Daniel Jones will just be waiting for you to finish the juke and then be open in space over the middle or wherever it may be. And even though we know it's anticipation throws from the quarterback, the shorter distance that you're accomplishing that in means you're going to have more time in the pocket to make those choices. The other guys, obviously, the only other two we're going to touch on here is going to be, and it's primarily going to be Azeez Ojulari. A little footnote on Aaron Robinson. The only risk coming out of some of these scouts would be the idea of his size. He's a little bit undersized. Does he have enough of the length? Everything that it is in a positive way to me. Some scouts said everything he does is effort, which I'm like, okay, great. I love that. I love a guy that's predicated purely on accomplishing things through effort. But some people were saying, is there a little bit of a risk with him? But we just mentioned Kwity Paye about the possibility of taking him at 20. One scout said, Ojulari had 8.5 sacks in 2020 in the SEC. The biggest season Kwity Paye has ever had is 6.5 in the Big Ten. So, relatively speaking, the sample size, we say that everyone thinks Kwity Paye is just scratching the surface. But remember, Azeez Ojulari is just 20 years old. So his surface is at best a footnote to what we think he's going to be capable of. And when you bring him into a talented room, I think you mentioned this last time, Andy, around Leonard Williams taking on double teams on the other side at stretches, right? If you line him up in the right position, you're going to allow offenses to be preoccupied with so many other areas that Ojulari, at least early in his career, is going to have every opportunity to kind of approach it the way he did in college. Use your athleticism, use your speed, get guys one-on-one, go around the edge and get after the quarterback with effort and energy.
Well, what I find interesting is we should have known that the Giants were going to get Ojulari, and we should have known that because of how the Giants approached free agency. Like, one of the whispers was that the Giants were pursuing Leonard Floyd very hard and potentially giving him a contract of $15-16 million a year. Leonard Floyd is 6'4"-ish, maybe, about 6'4", 240 pounds. Went to the University of Georgia, outside edge rushing guy, can get to the quarterback. I wish there was a comp in this draft for someone like Leonard Floyd, who maybe is an outside edge rushing linebacker from Georgia who's 6'3", 240. Like, I don't know, Adam.
If I could find one, I tell you, Andy, but I'm sorry. It's just not the way that the NFL draft works.
I mean, hindsight's 20/20, but when you think about the Giants were going to hand a Brinks truck to Leonard Floyd and the comp was Azeez Ojulari in the draft, it just made so much sense for the Giants, and the fact that they traded back and still got him at 50, incredible. But yeah, I mean, listen, some people were worried about his knee injury from high school. Dr. James Andrews came out and said he's fine. Azeez Ojulari has said a million times, I've been cleared a bunch. I don't know what else I can do. It was from high school. Everyone says I'm fine. Like, do what you want with that information, right?
No.
Like they're like, no, you're injured. He's like, I don't know. Doctors cleared me. What do you want me to do? And they're like, you're injured. He's like, okay, I guess. Like, what?
It's not going to work out for you, buddy. It's not going to work out. And that's why, unfortunately, I hate to do this, but the breaking news that we were trying to hold out on the podcast is Azeez Ojulari is effectively retiring from the NFL. And he's actually going into real estate. He's hoping that maybe, listen, property values are obviously at an all-time high, and he thinks that there's a market there for him for sure.
Oh, it's not cryptocurrency? He's not becoming a crypto financial planner?
He talks about mining a little bit, but ultimately you got to go with, cornerstone stability in the American marketplace. The only other guys, listen, they spoke positively about Robinson. We don't have to really belabor that point. And then again, same thing, an unsung hero kind of regarded by most scouts was Ellerson Smith. And I think that makes it very interesting. And I'll even put the footnote in there that when you talk about a Todd McShay and where the Giants would go in next year's draft, I just think these are the kind of things that make it a little bit silly or a little bit frivolous, because you don't know. Azeez Ojulari and Ellerson Smith could end up being what you assume that Ojulari will. But if Ellerson Smith becomes, what we thought maybe Lorenzo Carter was going to be, and minus the injury, and has some of that ability to get to the quarterback and do some things effectively, if these guys work out over the course of the year, all of a sudden the boards look dramatically different the following season. So again, shame on you, Todd McShay. Let's get into though I was gonna say the bulk of why we're here, but the podcast is nearly over, friends, and good for us. My God, we did it. The roster. The all too early idea around the roster and what we think is going to happen as we get into training camp. You and I talked a little bit about, I think we did, that if you remember, go back to last year, following the draft itself, the Giants were incredibly active in the undrafted free agent market, right? Brought in a lot of bodies, a lot of guys they liked, and a lot of the signings were well regarded. This year was a lot more quiet. And I think I was actually speaking with pessimistic Mike about it because he was hoping that they would have been more active. And I said, yeah, but you got to think, they were trying to do the reconstruction of the roster these last couple of years. You're trying to turn over the back end here. That's why you're going for the young players to be able to fix some of what went so wrong under Jerry Reese. This year, you do feel better about it. There's still positions that you want to improve, but you feel a lot better than you did a year ago or 2 years ago, so you can be a little bit more selective in that regard, let alone that we don't have a ton of spaces. Where do you look on this roster as key areas that the Giants are going to be making maybe some difficult decisions and in a positive way?
Well, you brought up a good point, Adam. It takes two to tango. And if you're an undrafted free agent and you have the opportunity to look out there and say, okay, I'm going to try to make the back end of a roster, or I definitely want to make sure I secure a practice squad position. Like, if you're looking to be a undrafted cornerback, like, going to the Giants is probably not where you want to go to try to sneak on the roster, because there's a lot of competition going on there for only one, maybe two spots. So positionally, the Giants are pretty deep at a lot of different areas. So if you're a wide receiver, for instance, are you really going to want to sign with the Giants when there's probably 15 other teams that you have a better chance of making the roster? So it is interesting that we didn't sign that many practice squad players, but we have some really good guys that are from last year that we're still high on, that we want to take a look on, that are still trying to crack the roster as well. When we look at the Giants roster, and the 53-man roster could be, as you mentioned, 55, depending on how they do a lot of the COVID protocols this year. There's a couple areas where we know exactly what the depth chart is going to look like. At quarterback, we know it's going to be Daniel Jones. We know it's going to be Mike Glennon, and that's it in the room. There are areas where there is still a lot of question marks. And one of them, unsurprisingly, is wide receiver. After taking Kadarius Toney, in my opinion, it looks like there are 4 wide receivers that are locks to be on this roster. Who are those 4 locks, Adam?
Well, that would be 1, Kenneth Golladay, 1, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, and of course, the first-round draft pick, Kadarius Toney.
Exactly. You nailed it. And so we know those 4 are going to be on the roster. What it's looking like is most teams like to have about 6 wide receivers. So that leaves 2 more spots. And what's interesting is that's 2 spots for guys like John Ross, Austin Mack, Dante Pettis. CJ Board is another one. Alex Bachman is another name that was on the practice squad last year. There's only 2 spots for that type of talent at the back end of our wide receiver room. So, Adam, I ask you, is there a preference if we only can take 2 guys from the rest of that group? There's Derek Dillon and there's other guys on the practice squad, but I think, more than likely the guys I just mentioned are going to be the ones in competition. Any of those guys, do you kind of lock in on a combo for what they can do situationally?
Yeah, they brought back CJ Board on the idea of his special teams capabilities, but then you think about taking a late round flyer on another cornerback. There's some special teams value there as well. John Ross, return man, potentially, as is Pettis. To me, it's right there. It's the guy you just brought in, the former first-round pick in John Ross, another player that can take things over the top. Now, is there some world where he loses out in the shuffle of of training camp, and you're trying to have this balance, and maybe a CJ Board or someone else has more value to the roster overall? Possibly. But I just think, unless that was the safeguard against not getting a wide receiver that you wanted in the draft, maybe that's the case. But John Ross and Pettis have the most upside, the most potential to be impact players. And if you start to think about rotating guys in and out here, it means, listen, Kadarius Toney is still going to have to learn, right? All rookies have to learn. Think about a guy like Jefferson last year for the Vikings, right? Ended up being an absolute stud, but also took him a handful of weeks to get his feet underneath him. So if you want to have a guy that's good in tight spaces, that can make some of those plays, John Ross can be that player. And then if you think about balancing of who's on or off the field, if Galladay is going to come off for a play and you want to add extra speed, then it's Ross. Then maybe it's Pettis and his skill set, or Slayton, or Shepard when he comes off, right? Put Pettis into the slot at times. So those are the 2 guys that I just think have the best talent level. They have the best opportunity to be contributors to this team. Everybody else is playing for practice squad positions or special teams contributions. And I just don't think that the Giants are going to go too deep at the wide receiver position on this roster. Like you said, I think it's going to be a tight 6, and then you're going to invest positional value on this roster in a lot of other areas.
I think the simple answer, and you actually went with the combo that I agree with, but the simple answer is follow the money, right? Follow the money. That's usually going to be the best indicator.
Sorry.
So when you actually do that, you realize CJ Board signed a $1 million deal in the offseason to come back to the Giants. Only $50,000 of that is guaranteed money. So they could, part ways with CJ Board, doesn't hurt their cap hit. Whereas a guy like John Ross, as you mentioned before, he has a $1 million guaranteed salary and the dead cap hit is $1 million. So by the Giants keeping John Ross, they keep a roster spot and can pay him. Whereas CJ Board, they can walk away without anything impacting them at all. And, you look at a guy like Dante Pettis, he's making $1.3 million this year. So, none of that is actually guaranteed, Adam, which I found fascinating. So if you want to get creative with the salary cap, the only thing I could see is bringing in a guy or activating Austin Mack to the roster for $500,000 or $600K, getting rid of Dante Pettis and saving yourself $700,000 or $800,000 if the dollars and cents, at the back end really start getting tight for the Giants.
And that probably speaks to if there's a player on the market, right? If a player gets cut and you need to create the space for him. And by the way, any of these guys, I'm not going to cry crocodile tears over Pettis being cut if it frees up room to go get another player that can contribute. Then we talk about the cornerback room, obviously very crowded. I feel like that's an easy place to go, and maybe into the linebacking, edge rushing core. What is that the other area that you focus in on as far as big decisions and players that we've seen here for a couple of years that could be gone in the blink of an eye?
Yeah, the cornerback room is going to look drastically different when you add Aaron Robinson and Adoree Jackson in the offseason, and then you have Sam Beal opting back in. He may be opting back in, but the Giants may be opting out of him, right? Like he's like, "Hey, I'm back." They're like, "No, you're not. We'll see you later."
Yeah,
have a good day. But when you look at the cornerback room, it is getting quite crowded, and that's a good thing. There's a ton of competition. We know Bradbury will be on their roster. We know Adoree Jackson will be there. We know Aaron Robinson will be there, and we know Darnay Holmes will potentially be there. I think, right? But then you got guys like even Holmes, Mondre Harper, you've got Sam Beal, you've got Isaac Yedem. There's a lot of combinations of different cornerbacks that have come and gone or stuck around. Is there anyone that you are very concerned for in terms of making the roster out of that group?
Well, it's funny. Yadam took a pay cut to stay on this roster. I almost think that he might be a candidate for a trade potentially, right? I mean, like, he showed enough for you last season that he is talented and you maybe want to continue to develop him. Maybe, remember, the Giants gave up a 6th-round pick to bring him over. Maybe there's a 5th-round pick value from a team that needs a little bit of depth at that position around the league, and we feel so deep. I really think that Sam Beal is kind of the X factor in that room. If he comes back into training camp and he shows that he is anywhere near the 3rd-round compensatory pick the Giants spent on him, it's probably worth it. Even in the final year of his contract, it's probably worth it for the Giants to keep him on the roster. He does represent a different type of cornerback than what the Giants have there, as far as, and some guys that are a little bit on the smaller side, a little bit leaner. I think he has that prototypical kind of length and quickness that you want at the position. So if he shows up in training camp, then I could see any number of these other, Harper or certainly a Yadam to go. Maybe a bubble player, maybe, would be a guy like Jordan Love. I tend to not think so, but it's a crowded secondary room. You have Logan Ryan, you drafted Xavier McKinney, you have Jabril Peppers. As much as we say he's a versatile player that can go in between cornerback and safety, the sample size suggests if you want to use him, you want him out of the safety role as opposed to lining him up. And then you drafted 2 cornerbacks. So again, numbers game maybe puts him in a difficult spot, but I would think if you're going to lean one way or the other, you keep a Love and maybe move on from Sam Beal, a Yadam, a Harper. So he's higher up the pecking order, but I think he's right on the edge of, maybe there's just not room to fill out a really talented secondary.
I think ultimately Julian Love, for me personally, is fairly safe because we only have 4 safeties and you want to make sure that you have backups for each of them in case something happens. We didn't even mention Rodarius Williams, who we drafted this year at the cornerback position as well. We're bringing in a ton of competition. This is all good stuff, Adam. For me, once we start getting into training camp, we have a competition for these spots, when last year we were basically trying to pry people off of other practice squads because we didn't have enough depth. We were like, please bring Yadam over here. We don't know what we have. Now you're talking about guys like Beal and Yadam and Rodarius Williams, like, fighting it out for one of those last roster spots. Our secondary is going to be very strong next year.
You better believe it. And at the end of the day, friends, as we like to say, we've seen Ricardo and Joseph getting into it in the chat over on YouTube. Ricardo making the excellent point. Just think back to 2-3 years ago, friends, and where this team was, where this roster was, what Dave Gettleman, ups and downs, we all know that, but what this organization has been able to accomplish, and the point we're at right now, where we're talking about, God, there could be a talented player that we just can't afford to keep on the roster because of what we have ahead of them. Good Lord. There was a point when we were trading to get linebackers that other guys wouldn't keep as backups on their team, right? So things have drastically improved. Now it is about getting into training camp, getting these guys in the trenches, getting into the fights, and starting to see that roster shake itself out.
Adam, even think back 1 year ago, when everyone was wildly upset that we cut Ryan Connolly, who had like 3 tackles for the Minnesota Vikings.
Come back to it.
Yeah. It will always be ingrained in my mind, the hysteria of releasing someone like that who barely even played for another team that wasn't very good, right? And now we fast forward and we're talking about, man, we're going to have to cut some talented players. Where are we going to trim the fat? You got to feel excited about the depth that the Giants have been able to build over the last 18 to 24 months. I'm so excited.
In DG, you're GD right. I'm excited. Follow the podcast. Of course, someone asked the question. We're available on every platform that you could possibly imagine. Spotify, Apple, all those big ones, obviously. So please go out there, rate the podcast if you're enjoying it. Follow us on YouTube, where we're doing it live 3 days a week. Follow us on social media, One Giant Podcast as well. And as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and certainly demand you to know,
yes. Let's go Big Blue.
Yes, sir. I've been working on, as we drift out of the outro here, I've been working on, you tell me, noodle salad. This is Jack Nicholson. Thanks for listening to the podcast. I think it's solid. I think I got something there.
You might want to hold on to that one.
Yeah, I'll put it in the bank.